There's a siren on the loose. I just heard it, but I waited for it to stop. The thing is that once it's out, you can't trust it. It can start again any second. Alright, well, we'll hope for the best. Hopefully the siren guy won't be so trigger happy. Friends, let's do it. Well, welcome back to Babylon Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Chav Vav of Masechta Ayruvin. Daf 26. Yud Ke Vav Ke. Can't be too bad. Well, I'll leave that to you to determine. Chavre, we begin with talking about adding a residential space to an existing karpaf to try to make it kind of residentially, right? You have a karpaf that's larger than a beis hasayim that is not set aside for living space, so it's too big. But what if you build a residential space darton? So can you now carry in this karpaf as sort of a residential kind of area? We saw Rabbi Eli had this opinion in the Mishnah that he alleged that according to Rabbi Eliezer, a karpaf can even be the size of a core. We're going to briefly discuss that. And then we are going to discuss that situation that also came up in the Mishnah from Rabbi Eli, which is that the situation where you have 5 people, let's say, in a chutzner, and when they went to make the Eruv, one of them was hanging out at the mikveh, so he couldn't join them. So what can you do to enable everybody to be able to carry in that chutzner even without the mikveh man? Alright. Let us begin on Daf Chav Hei Amud Beis. 4 lines to the bottom. Hahi Avvarnaka. I hope I pronounced that right. There's a certain, how did the art school define Avvarnaka? A arbor. Okay? There was an arbor. Y'all know what an arbor is, right? Wrong. There must be somebody who doesn't know what an arbor is. I didn't know what an arbor is. What can I tell you? Chevre, so there's a diagram, Lamaisa, on 25b2 that shows kind of what the situation is. Basically, you have this house, and you have this big karpaf outside the house. Now, this karpaf is larger than a beis hasayim, and it was not hukaf lidira. Okay, so basically you cannot carry in this karpaf, but you want to be able to carry in the karpaf. Now, in this karpaf, apparently very fancy people, such as the Reis Gelusa, they would have this tree in their karpafs, a very shady tree. And then when it's hot outside, this was of course before air conditioning, so they would have different hacks to try to keep themselves cool. And one of these included having a tree in their backyard that they could sit under. Now, the thing is, you can't actually carry in this karpaf because it's too big and it's not for residential space. So what they wanted to do is they put up these kind of temporary walls around this tree area so that they would be able to hang out under the tree on Shabbos. This is what we're talking about. So, so the Reish Gelusa in his orchard, in this karpaf that was behind his house, so he had this tree that they would sit under when it was hot out in order to cool down. So now, Amulei l'Rav Huna bar Chinina li'avid mar takanta t'l'macha nochal na mahasam. So the Reish Gelusa requested of Rav Huna bar Chinina, and the Reish Gelusa said, "Hey, Rav Huna bar Chinina, can you make sure that we'll be able to, carry things from our house to this tree area so we can hang out there tomorrow on Shabbos?" This conversation was happening on Friday. So Rav Huna bar Chinina kind of played it safe, and what did he do? So Azal Avid Kana Kana Pachas Mishlosha. So what he did was, as you can see in the diagram, he basically put up a bunch of beams that were each less than 3 tvachim away from each other. Essentially, he built a wall, and certainly within that wall, you'll be able to carry from the house and under the tree. It's all enclosed, and that would be fine. Also, Rava shalfinu. Rava then thought that this was completely extra, that there was no halachic sense in building this wall, and he took down all these poles. Right? He basically deconstructed this thing that Rav Huna bar Chinina said, because his opinion was you don't need it. meaning you have this karpaf, and you built these walls around this tree, these temporary walls around this tree so you can hang out there. That's enough to make it a residential space. You don't need all these little pillars that Rav Huna bar Chinina put up so you'll be able to carry from the house to get to that space. Okay. Also Rav Papa, Rav Huna bar Brei, Rav Yoshua, Naktinu Mibasre, and then the final straw was that Rav Papa and Rav Huna bar Rav Yoshua went and they took these beams that Rava kind of took out of the ground and they cleared them away so that they were like mamish completely gone. So Rava dismantled Rav Huna bar Chinina's work. Rav Papa and Rav Huna bar Rav Yoshua now came and dragged away these poles. So all of Rav Huna bar Chinina's work was 100% completely undone by Rava and his students, Rav Papa and Rav Huna bar Rav Yoshua, which is cool because there's a Rashi there, 3 lines into the widest lines of Rashi. It says, "Va'asu tamidei de Rava, Rav Papa, Rav Huna bar Rav Yoshua naktinu." Right? So we see that Rav Papa and Rav Huna bar Rav Yoshua were students of Rava. I always like that stuff. Kind of puts things, another piece kind of falls into place of who was a student of who. Okay. Now, so basically, what do we see so far? So we have this karpaf, shelo ukaf ledira, and it was bigger than a beis hasayim, so you cannot carry there. But then they built this temporary space around this tree. They kind of put up these temporary walls around this tree so that you can hang out under the tree. Now, this is not talking about Rav Huna bar Chinina's lovewood walls that we're to know, right? Meaning, you have the karpaf. Inside the karpaf, there's this tree. They have these kind of temporary walls that they would put up, or even, I don't know if they were necessarily temporary. Did they have to be temporary? I don't know if they necessarily had to be temporary. They could have just been walls that you put around this tree. So you could sit under this tree. The question is, you can't actually carry in the karpaf because it is larger than a beis hasayim and it was lo ukaf ledira. So you can't carry in the karpaf. So how do you kind of get all your food from the house to get under the tree? So Rav Huna bar Chinina basically constructed walls from the house to the tree so that you can carry from the house to the tree. Whereas Rava's opinion was that actually by building these walls around this tree so you can hang out there, that was enough to make the karpaf a residential space, and now you can carry in the entire karpaf. Fine. Now the next day on Shabbos, when it was too late to actually fix anything, Ravina said to Rava, Ir chadasha modedin la miyeshivasa v'yishana mechomasa. So Ravina said, look, Rava, there's a brisa that says that if you have a new city, which we're going to define what that means in a minute, modedin la miyeshivasa, so then we measure in terms of Tchum Shabbos, in terms of having 2,000 amas to be able to walk outside of the city on Shabbos, we define that by its houses, not by its walls. V'yishana mechomasa, whereas in older city, we measure the 2,000 amas from its walls, not from its houses. Ezui chadash ve'ezui yishana, what's considered a new city that we measure from the houses, and what's considered an old city that we measure from the walls? Chadasha shu kafel v'sof yashva. So Chadasha is a city that the wall pre-existed the houses. And we're saying that in that case, that we don't measure by the wall, we measure by the houses that are inside the wall. Yashva yishana yashva levasofu kafa. And an old city is one that the houses preceded the walls. And in that case, we measure based on the walls. And this karpaf that they then built the wall around this tree is like hukafel v'sof yashva. Nu cheveh, what do we see? So we have a brisa, and the brisa says that when you have an area enclosed by a wall, and then you build a bunch of houses in there, so so the wall is insignificant. We measure the Tchum Shabbos from the houses that were built afterwards. And there's no significance to the wall. And we see that in a brisa. So what Ravina is asking against Rava is that this karpaf should just be like that city, i.e., in this karpaf, it was first hukaf shelo l'shem dira, and it's more than a beis hasayim, so it's too big. It's a karpaf that you can't carry in. After the fact, then, we built this area around this tree so that you can hang out there for residential space, but that has no bearings on the giving significance to the wall. And the wall, just like it was hukaf shelo l'shem dira, and therefore you're not allowed to carry in the karpaf. So putting up this residential space inside the karpaf gives no extra significance to the walls, and you still can't carry in this karpaf. So it's not going to be like a situation of like, you put up these walls now, the shem dira. No, there's no significance to these walls. Just like in the city, that first there was the wall and then the houses came later, there's no significance to the walls, and you would measure from the houses. So therefore the kasha against Rava is, so it would seem from this brisa that putting up this wall around, creating this residential space around this tree had no effect in making this karpaf a residential space, and therefore you're not allowed to carry in the karpaf, and therefore Rav Huna bar Chinina was correct in putting up these walls to be able to carry from the house to this residential tree space. Amalei Rav Papa le Rava. Now interestingly, Rav Papa and Rav Huna bar Rav Yoshua were the ones who kind of did the final task after Rava dismantled these beams. They then cleared them away. Now interestingly, Rav Papa and then Rav Huna bar Rav Yoshua are each actually going to now question Rava's, if Rava was really correct in doing what he did, even though they seemed to have been on board the previous day when they cleared away these beams. So Rav Papa le Rava. Now Rav Papa asked against Rava, Amar Rav Asi, didn't Rav Asi say, now I assume that this is Rav Asi, the Amora from Bavel, who was the Talmud Chaver of Rav. Mechitzas adrechalin loshma mechitza. That if you have workers, and the workers put up this wall, like a temporary wall, just so that they can, get some respite from the sun. So Alma came to the Tzniusa Avida, La avi mechitza. So since they're making this wall just l'tznius, they're making this wall just so that they can, be able to hide from the sun, so it's not a real wall. So Achanami came to the Tzniusa Avida, Lo avi mechitza. So here also, this wall that they make around this tree for shade, it's not really a good mechitza, and it's not, going to be significant in trying to define this karpaf as a residential space. Ve'amar Rav Huna bar Rav Yoshua, and now Rav Huna bar Rav Yoshua said to Rava, Ve'amar Rav Huna, didn't Rav Huna say mechitza asui lenachas loshma mechitza, that a wall that you put up in order to put things down in that space is not considered a significant wall? The Rav bar Avua ma'ayv lechula mechoza arsiyasa mishum peira devei toreh. Because Rabbi bar Avua would make an Eruv in the entire Mechoza, every neighborhood, right, neighborhood by neighborhood. So it's interesting that Rabbi bar, we always talk about Rava in the context of Mechoza. Now we're seeing that Rabbi bar Avua was also connected to Mechoza. Rabbi bar Avua was an earlier Amora, right? Often we see Rav Nachman quoting Rabbi bar Avua. Now we're seeing Rav Huna quote Rabbi bar Avua. So he was earlier than Rava, and I guess he already had a connection to Mechoza. So maybe Rava wasn't really the first one there in Mechoza. But anyways. And then we see that Rav Papa and Rav Huna bar Rav Yoshua were also students of Rava. Maybe this was all going down in Mechoza. Maybe there was a lot going on there in Mechoza. Anyways, so where was I? Right. So what is this case? So here it helps to look at the diagram over here on 26A1. So you can see all those houses there. All those houses represent Mechoza. And what's interesting about this setup is that the way that all the houses are constructed with their chutzers and the walls around them, essentially Mechoza is a walled city. Meaning there's not really like a wall around it, but by default you have all these chutzers, the chutzers are next to each other, there's walls surrounding the entire city. So you might think that you should be able to make like one Eruv for the entire city. But Rabbi bar Avua actually would say that no, you cannot make an Eruv for the entire city because it's not considered fully enclosed, and rather each little chutzer needs to make their own Eruv. How come? Because if you look closely at the diagram, there are these large kind of roads in Mechoza that go from east to west, and they would have food for animals in those roads. They would like kind of dig out space, and then they would fill it with like date pits and stuff, and the animals would eat that. So because those areas were really just for putting date pits there, so the walls that enclosed them are not considered significant walls, and therefore the wall surrounding Mechoza, where it's really just enclosing the area where there was food, so where they would like put down food over there, so that was not considered a significant wall, and therefore Rabbi bar Avua did not consider Mechoza to be completely enclosed, and that's why he said that every chutzner had to make their own Eruvei Chatzeris. So says the Gemara, and these these places where they would put down food for the animals is basically an area that you're putting things down in. And also, and we're saying that the walls are insignificant. And here also, by under this tree, this is essentially an area where they would like put things down over there. Rashi says something where they would take off their clothing over there. I don't know, maybe, I don't know. Maybe they wear shorts and t-shirts. Maybe they wear babkis. I don't know. But whatever it is, it was a place where they would put things there in. And therefore, it's not a significant wall. Alright? No? So, Chevra, to recap, what did we just see? We saw that there was a karpaf. Now, this karpaf was not carryable. Now, in the karpaf, there was this tree. They built this little enclosure around the tree. The question is, can you carry in this karpaf on account of that enclosure? Rav Huna bar Chinana assumed not, and therefore he built some kind of wall from the Reish Galusa's house to get to the tree. Rava disagreed, and he actually dismantled this wall. Then we have three kashas on Rava, one from Ravina, one from Rav Papa, and one from Rav Huna bar Rav Yoshua, all of them claiming that the wall around this tree is not going to be enough to allow you to carry in this karpaf. Okay, fine. So now, the Reish Galusa said about Rav Papa and Rav Huna bar Rav Yoshua, who the previous day kind of supported Rava and moved away these beams that Rava dismantled, and then all of a sudden on Shabbos, when it's too late to actually fix anything, all of a sudden they start coming up with proofs why Rava is actually wrong, and now the Reish Galusa can't bring out his food for his lunch. And he says, he quotes the pasuk of Chachamim le'ara. They're very smart when it comes to make a mess, but they don't know how to actually do anything good. Okay, fine. Also, by the way, it's very interesting the reaction of the Reish Galusa when it's Rava versus when it was Rav Sheshes and his attendant. What was his name? Rav Gada. That remember with Rav Sheshes and Rav Nachman. So there was. No, was it Rav Sheshes and Rav Nachman? No, it was Rav Sheshes and somebody else. I don't remember who it was. But basically, it had to do with the, what was it called? The, Tzuras HaPesach. Two the walls have to reach up to the Tzuras HaPesach, and Rav Sheshes felt that they did. And therefore he dismantled the Reish Galusa's kind of like Tzuras HaPesach, and then they threw his attendant in jail. But over here, the Reish Galusa doesn't seem to be too upset with Rava. Amar Bilai Shamaitim Rabbi Eliezer v'afilu beis kor. So Rabbi Eli said in the Mishnah that he had heard from Rabbi Eliezer that a karpaf can even be the size of a beis kor. Now, of course, we know by now that a beis kor is 30 sa'ah. Masisim lo kechananya. Well, this would be not like Chananya. Titanya Chananya omer v'afilu hi arba'im sa'ah kisrat shamelech. Chananya says that actually he heard from Rabbi Eliezer that the karpaf can even be 40 sa'ah. Okay, not just 30. Rabbi Yochanan said, and they're both learning it out from the same pasuk. Shneimar, it says by Yeshayahu, after he went to visit Chizkiyahu, by Yeshayahu lo yatsa chatzer hatichona, that it was, before Yeshayahu even reached the middle chatzer, then God already said that Chizkiyahu had been healed. So it's actually written in the Tanakh. It says Ha'ir, the city, but we read it Chatzer. What's the deal? What's the relationship between city and Chatzer? So we see from here that the courtyards of the palaces of the kings were like the size of a mid-sized city. Havyan. Where am I? Well, it was Benonios. Fine. So Micah Miflagi, okay, and what's the machlokas between Rabbi Eli and Chananya regarding this pasuk? So Masavar Ayarus Benonios Havyon Beiskor, Masavar Mem Sa Havyon. Okay, that basically Rabbi Eli from this pasuk figured, okay, well these Chatzeris were the size of a small city, and small cities were 30 sa, whereas Chananya holds that these small cities were 40 sa. Okay, very nice. Vishayahu my bayasam. The question is, why was Yeshayahu in this back Chatzer? If he was going to the palace of Chizkiyahu, so Mistama he would go through the front Chatzer. Why is he going through this back Chatzer? So Rabbi Bar Bachana Rabbi Yochanan Melamed Shechalach Chizkiyahu. So it teaches that Chizkiah got sick. Oh, so what did Yeshayahu do? Well, he wanted to create good vibes so that Tzidkiyahu should get healed. So he set up a yeshiva in the backyard of the palace to create kind of good energy so that Chizkiah should get healed. So we see that if a Talmud Chacham gets sick, you should set up a yeshiva right outside wherever he's sick. Vilav Milsi, the Gemara says, yeah, but that's actually not true. Because we're concerned that actually if you set up a yeshiva over there, well then the Satan might get, what's it called? Really dig himself in his determination to kill the Talmud Chacham, right? Meaning if he sees you studying Torah, he's going to make him more brazen. He says, oh yeah, you think that you can just beat me with a little bit of Torah? And then he's going to really try to kill this fellow, this Talmud Chacham. So therefore better to just kind of like keep things on the DL and maybe just study in your yeshiva with Kavanah to send good vibes towards the sick Talmud Chacham. Okay, Rashi says that what does he say? He says that the Satan is the Malach HaMoves. Oy va'avoy. Chevre, let's move on. V'chein shamayte imenu, anshe chatzer sheshachach echad v'lo erev beiso aser. No. So Rabbi Eli had said in the Mishnah that he heard from Rabbi Eliezer that if you have a bunch of people that live in one chutzner, right? Let's say 5 fellows and they live in a chutzner, and okay, so there are 5 homes in the chutzner that open up into the chutzner. Fine. Now it's Erev Shabbos, right before Shabbos, and they say, okay, Chevre, let's go make this Ayruvin Chatzeris, and one of them cannot be found. So the Gemara says, I think the lashon of shachach, he forgot. So one of them forgot and he didn't join in the Erev. So now what do? So on the one hand, you can't carry in this chotzer because in order to be able to carry, right, the chotzer is jointly owned by all of them, right? Everyone has their own rights to the chotzer. There's 5 houses. Each homeowner is allowed to use the chotzer. So therefore you can't carry in the chotzer. So the solution, of course, is to make an Erev. They all join together and say, okay, we all jointly own this chotzer. And since we all jointly own this chotzer, so then it belongs to all of us, as a collective, and we can now carry from our houses into the chotzer. It's no problem. However, one of these guys is not included. So now basically you have, the chotzer is really owned by 2 parties now. The 4 houses that they all joined together, but then there's this other guy who didn't join together with them. And because, this chotzer is now owned by essentially 2 parties, so now nobody can carry in the chotzer. So what they do is, so the guy who forgot and wasn't included in the Eruv, he could be mevatel his rights to the chotzer and say, you know what, I don't have any rights to this chotzer, in which case he no longer has any right to the chotzer, he doesn't have any part in the chotzer, and the chotzer now is 100% owned by this conglomerate, by this group of the 4 people who came together, and they can all carry to and from their houses and into the chotzer and into each other's houses because they're all kind of jointly owned. And now, Rabbi Eli had said in the Mishnah that not only can they carry to each other's houses and into the chotzer, they can even carry from the chotzer into this other fellow's house. The fellow who was not included in the Erev, who was mevatel his rights to the chotzer, they can even carry from the chotzer into his house. Just that he can't carry from his house into the chotzer and vice versa. But he can even carry, in the chotzer, he can carry because he was mevatel his rights over there. Just like a guest would be allowed to carry in the chotzer or from their houses, between the houses, right? This fellow has every right as a guest would have, just he can't carry between his house and the chotzer because that would show that he's like taking ownership of his house. And he said he was mevatel, at least his chotzer. The question is, how do we relate to the house? So Rabbi Eli is quoting the name of Rabbi Eliezer that everybody else would be allowed to carry from the chotzer into this fellow's house, but this fellow cannot carry from his house into the chotzer. Fine. But we learn in a Mishnah, but we have a Mishnah that comes up later on that says that actually this fellow's house, he cannot carry from it into the chotzer and vice versa, but also the other people cannot carry from the chotzer into his house and from his house into the chotzer. So Ki'ilu, in the Mishnah, we seem to be saying that Rabbi Eli is quoting Rabbi Eliezer as saying that everybody would be able to carry from the chotzer into this fellow's house. Yet we have a Mishnah later on that's saying that this fellow's house is off limits. They can all carry between everybody else's houses, between their houses and the Chatzar, all of that's fine, but this fellow's house is off limits. So Amar Rav Huna Bar Rav Yoshua, Amar Rav Sheshes Lo Kasha. Har Rabbi Eliezer Bar Rabbanan. So it says of Huna Bar Rav Yoshua in the name of Rav Sheshes that it's no problem. It's easy to answer. Our Mishnah, of course, is Rabbi Eli quoting Rabbi Eliezer, whereas the later Mishnah, which says that this fellow's house is completely off limits, so then that is the Chachamim's opinion. Okay, fine. Kshetimtze lomar l'divrei Rabbi Eliezer, ha'mevatel reshus chavero, reshus beiso bitel. And the point is that according to Rabbi Eliezer, when this fellow, let's just call him Reuven, so we don't have to call him this fellow. So when Reuven is mevatel his rights to the Chatzar, right? He has all of his other friends who live in the Chatzar with him. Now he forgot and didn't join with them in the Eruv. So he now on Shabbos is mevatel his rights to the Chatzar, right? He says that he doesn't have, he relinquishes any rights that he has to the Chatzar. I mean, he can still use it, but any sort of ownership that he has of the Chatzar, he relinquishes that ownership, and therefore now the Chatzar is completely owned by everybody else who joined together in to jointly own this Chatzar and the houses and everything. So now, they can all carry between the houses and the Chatzar and everything. Now, according to Rabbi Eliezer, when Reuven is mevatel rights to the Chatzar, he's also mevatel the rights to his house. And because he's also mevatel the rights to his house, so everybody can also, not only can they carry in the Chatzar, they can also carry things in and out of his house. The only thing is that he wouldn't be able to carry things in and out of his house, because by carrying things in and out of his house, he's kind of showing a sense of ownership. And he said that after all, that he's mevatel his house. So therefore, we don't want him carrying things in and out of his house, but everybody else, since he was mevatel not only his Chatzar, but also his house, so therefore everybody else can carry from their houses and the Chatzar to each other's houses, and including this fellow's house. But the Rabbanan, hamvatel shus Chatzar u'shus beiso lo bitel. Whereas the rabbis say that no, when Reuven is mevatel his rights to the Chatzar, is mevatel his rights to the Chatzar, but that's it. He retains his rights to his house. Right, that's not what he includes. He doesn't include his house, and therefore, if he didn't include his house, so while everybody else can now carry in the Chatzar because he was mevatel his rights to the Chatzar, so only the conglomerate that everybody else that came together now fully owns the Chatzar, but he doesn't include his house. That's his intention is not to include his house, and therefore they cannot carry into his house because they don't jointly own his house, and he also cannot carry from his house into the Chatzar because it's going from something owned by him to something owned by this conglomerate. Fine. So Pshita, so the Gemara says, well, this is obvious, meaning the reason why Rabbi Eliezer says that they can even carry into his house is because he's mevatel also his house, and the reason why, according to Chacham, you cannot carry into his house is because he's not mevatel his house. Amar Rachba says, Rachba, Aniv Rav Huna bar Chinana tagimna. So Rachba says, look, I and Rav Huna bar Chinana can explain to you what exactly is going on with this explanation of Rabbi Eliezer and the Chacham and why it's significant. Lo nitzurcha ela lechamisha sheshruim b'chatzar echad. So what it's needed for is when you have 5 people that live together in a chatzar. V'shachach echad mein v'lo erev. Okay, and one of them forgot and did not join them in the erev. So now the divrei Rabbi Eliezer. So now according to Rabbi Eliezer, who kind of understands the kavana of this person who is mevatel his chatzar more liberally and assumes that it also includes his house. Well, kshumevatel reshuso ein tzarich levatel l'chol echad v'echad. So when he's mevatel his reshus, he doesn't have to go to each and every one of the remaining 4 people and tell them individually, I'm mevatel my reshus, because it's understood that just like when he's mevatel reshus to the chatzar, he's also mevatel reshus to his house. So also when he's mevatel, when he tells one of the people that he's mevatel, he doesn't have to then go and tell everybody else that he's being mevatel, because it's assumed that he's mevatel to everybody. Whereas the Rabbanan, but according to the Rabbanan, who say that when he's mevatel reshus to his chatzar, that's all, to the chatzar, that's why he's mevatel. He's not mevatel reshus to his house. So we see that you can't just assume, whatever he's what we can only assume that he's mevatel whatever he said that he's mevatel, and he's not mevatel what he doesn't say he's mevatel. Well, or whatever. When he's not mevatel anything else. That got confusing, right? It doesn't have to be. Basically, you can only take what he says at face value, and therefore, when he says that he's mevatel his reshus to the chatzar, so that's it. He's not mevatel reshus to his house, and also, when he just says to one of the other people, that he's being mevatel the reshus to the chotzer, that doesn't necessarily imply that he's mevatel the reshus to the other people. So he has to go around to every single person and say to them that he's being mevatel the reshus to his chotzer. Right? So he has to tell every single person. And that is the significance of Rav Huna Bar Yeshua and Rav Shesh's explanation of saying that, according to Rabbi Eliezer, he implicitly is also mevatel reshus to his house, whereas according to Chacham he's not. There's also an afkamin in terms of does he have to be mevatel with every single person in the chutzner individually, or is it enough to be mevatel to one person, and that assumes that he's being mevatel to the whole chutzner. Fine. Come on, Azla Hadetanya. So the Gemara now says, like, who is the following brisa? Chamisha sheshrim b'chutzner echad. If you have 5 fellows who live in a chutzner together, v'tzarich echad man, v'shachach echad man, v'lo erev, and one of them forgot and did not join in the erev. Kshu mevatel reshuso and tzarich mevatel reshus l'chol echad v'echad. When he's mevatel his reshus, he does not have to mevatel reshus to each one individually. He could just mevatel to one, and that implies, that it applies to everybody. So Kiman Rabbi Eliezer, that is like Rabbi Eliezer. Rav Kahana Masnei Hachi, Rav Tavyomi Masnei Hachi. So Rav Kahana teaches this brisa in the way that we just read it. Rav Tavyomi teaches it very slightly differently, which is Kiman Azla Adetanya, like who does the following brisa go? Hey Sheshrim b'chatzar echad, you have 5 people who live in one chatzar, v'shachach echad man v'lo erev, and one of them forgot and didn't join in the erev. Kshu mevatel reshuso eno tzarich levatel reshus l'chol echad ve'echad. When he's mevatel his reshus, he doesn't have to be individually mevatel to every single person. Kiman, who's it like? So instead of saying that it's like Rabbi Eliezer, it says something slightly different, which is Amar Rav Huna Bar Yehuda, Amar Rav Sheshes, Kiman Rabbi Eliezer. That it's Rav Huna Bar Yehuda in the name of Rav Sheshes that it's like Rabbi Eliezer. Okay, but the net result remains the same. Weiter. Amar Rav Papa la Abaye. Rav Papa asked a kasha to Abaye. The Rabbi Eliezer. So according to Rabbi Eliezer, I Amar lo mevatilna. If he says explicitly, I'm not mevatel my house. And according to the rabbis, if he says explicitly, I am mevatel my house, what? Right? Because we said that according to Rabbi Eliezer, by being mevatel reshus to his chatzar, he's implicitly being mevatel reshus to his house. According to the Chachamim, he's only being mevatel reshus to the chatzar, but not the house. So we want to know, what if they were explicit? What if according to Rabbi Eliezer, he specifically said, look, I'm being mevatel my reshus to the chatzar, but not to my house. Or what about according to Chum, if he explicitly says, I am being mevatel reshus to my house? So do we say time in Rabbi Eliezer mishum de kasavar ha'mevatel reshus chatzero reshus beso bitel? Do we say that the reason for Rabbi Eliezer is because we're assuming that the assumption is that if somebody is mevatel reshus to his chatzar, so he's mistama also being mevatel reshus to his house. And this fellow is saying explicitly, I'm not being mevatel reshus to my house. So if he was explicitly said he's not being mevatel reshus to his house, he's not being mevatel reshus to his house. Okay, we can no longer imply that he's also being mevatel reshus to his house, because he specifically said that he's not. Odilma, or maybe the reason for Rabbi Eliezer is different. Time of Rabbi Eliezer, mishum debayis blochatzu avide inshe dedaire. It doesn't make sense for a person to live in a house without any rights to a chatzar. And therefore it wouldn't make any, if he says that he's mevatel reshus to the chatzar, well then, Memele is also mevatel reshus to his house, because people don't live in a house without access to a chatzar. And therefore, v'chika amr lo mevatilna, and then when he says that, well, I'm not being mevatel reshus to my house, and I'm maintaining reshus to my house, we say, you can't do that. There's no such thing as reshus to a house without reshus to a chatzar. Lav kol kamine, it's not in his power to be able to do that. Hafagav de amr dairana, even though he says, look, I'm still staying in my house, I'm keeping reshus to my house, ownership of my house, lav klum ka amar. He's not saying anything. So that's the question according to Rabbi Eliezer. That's what Papa is asking Abai. That according to Rabbi Eliezer, if a person specifically says, I'm maintaining the ownership of my house, so just not the chatzar, can he do that or not? Ulu Rabbanan, and then the inverse is according to Rabbanan. If he says, look, I'm being mevatel the rights to my house. What do we say? Do we say taima the Rabbanan mishum de kasaver amabatel reshus chatzer reshus beso lo bitel? Do we say, look, it's an assumption that we're making that the Chacham assume that if a person is being mevatel reshus to his chatzar, that is limited to his chatzar. It doesn't have any implications for his house. He retains ownership over his house. And this fellow says, look, I'm being mevatel the ownership to my house. So he can do that. We can no longer just assume that he's not relinquishing ownership of his house. He said he is. O Dilma, or perhaps, time of the Rabbanan, or maybe we could say, look, it doesn't make sense for a person to, or a person doesn't generally relinquish ownership, like completely relinquish all of his ownership in the chatzar, not only just to the courtyard, but also to his house. A person's not going to completely walk away from all of his ownership, and be a guest in them. And therefore this fellow, when he says, look, I want to also be mevatel my ownership, not just of the courtyard, but also of my house. So we say, you can't do that. People, that's weird. People don't normally do that. People won't just completely walk away from all ownership of everything that they have in this chatzar. So that's Rav Papa's kasha to Abaye. That according to Rabbi Eliezer, what happens if he explicitly says that he wants to retain ownership of his house? And what about according to the Rabbanan when he explicitly says that he wants to be mevatel ownership to his house? So Amalei, bein the Rabbanan, bein the Rabbi Eliezer, came in the gali daite gali. So Abaye answers, look, both according to Rabbi Eliezer and according to Rabbanan, if he explicitly says, that he does or does not want to retain ownership of his house, well then whatever he says goes. So there you go. So basically the idea is that according to Rabbi Eliezer and the Chacham, it's an assumption that we're making. That if he only says that he's mevatel reshus to his chatzar, what can we assume about his house? According to Rabbi Eliezer, we can assume that his house is also, he's mevatel. According to Chacham, you cannot assume that his house is mevatel. But if he tells us what his intention is, well then we go based on that. And says, Rabbi Eli, that I also heard from Rabbi Eliezer that you can be yotzei marer with our kablin, my kablin, amar Rish Lakish atzvasa choriziasa. What is this arkablin? So it says Rish Lakish that it is this stuff that grows around a palm tree, and I guess it's bitter, and you can use it for a mar on Pesach. Hadron alach osin pasin. We will come back to you at Perak osin pasin. Chevra, we have learned 2 prakim of Masechta Ayruvin. Kol kavod, it's pretty awesome. I think that there are 10 prakim of Masechta Ayruvin. So based on that, we're about 20% of the way through, but also based on pages, we're about 20% of the way through, which is pretty cool. Let's do a review. So Ayruvin Daf Chaf Vav. So we start off with adding a residential space to an existing karpaf. So, right, this was in the context of that tree in the karpaf of the Reish Galusa, in the orchard of the Reish Galusa that had like this wall around it. So Rav Huna Bar Chinina says that you can't carry in the karpaf, and therefore he constructed this wall essentially from the Reish Galusa to the tree. Rava dismantled the wall because he felt that by putting up the wall around the tree was enough to make it a residential karpaf, and you can carry over there. Then we had 3 brisas brought against Rava. Right, Ravina said that when you have a new city, so then the Tchum Shabbos is measured based on the houses, i.e. when you initially had a wall there and then you put up houses, the wall is insignificant, you go based on the houses. So here also, you had the karpaf and then you put up the area around the tree, that doesn't make a difference, you still can't carry in the karpaf. Rav Papa says that based on the fact that when you have an area for workers that is just there to get shade from the sun, it's not considered a real area, a real wall. So here also, this is just to get shade, and it's not going to be a real wall, and it doesn't have effects on converting this space into a residential space. And Rav Huna Bar Yoshua says that based on like Rabbi Bar Avu and Mechoza, that when you have a wall that's enclosing a space that you're just storing things there, like the food in Mechoza for the animals, so that is not a real wall. And here also they're just like put their clothes and stuff over there, so that wouldn't really be considered a real wall, and it would not be enough to convert this space into a residential space. We talked about the size of a karpaf according to Rabbi Eliezer. Eli seems to think that it is up to 30 sa'ah, up to a base core. Hanani says it could be 40 sa'ah. It says of Yochanan, they both learn it out from the pasuk by Yeshayahu. And then we talked about being mevatel your reshus on Shabbos, right? This guy who forgot to join in the Eruv, so now he wants to allow everybody else to carry, so he's mevatel his rights to the chatzer. The question is, does that also apply to his home with the nafkamina being, can other people carry also into his house? So, right, let's say he's hosting lunch. Can people bring over stuff and bring it to his house? Rabbi Eliezer says, sure, no problem. They can bring it into his house, because when he's mevatel his reshus to his access to the chatzar, he's also mevatel to his ownership of his house. Whereas the chacham say no. What he says, he says. What he doesn't say, he doesn't say. Therefore, if he's mevatel his ownership of the chatzar, that's it. He's mevatel his ownership for the chatzar, but not for his house. And then we say that if he explicitly, however, says that he does or does not want to retain ownership of the house, well, then we just go based on what he says. Chevra, that was Daf Chavav Masechta Ayruvin. I hope you enjoyed it very much. Have a great day, night, whatever. Peace.